Tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. E nā manuhiri matararahi, e nā hoa mahi, e nā toiera, e nā kaitotoko, me nā hoa. No mai haere mai, ki te wharewananga. A very warm welcome to our distinguished guests, colleagues, students, supporters, and our public community to the inaugural lecture of Professor of History, Kate Hunter, from the School of History, Philosophy, Political Science, and International Relations. In a COVID landscape, this inaugural has been a long while coming, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here in person this evening, including welcoming our Chancellor John Allen, joined by other council and senior leadership team members. For any guests who may not know me, I'm Jennifer Windsor, Acting Vice-Chancellor of Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Professor Kate Hunter, an internationally recognised expert on the histories of Australia and New Zealand during the 19th and early 20th centuries. She joined our university in 1995, received the university's Research Excellence Award in 2014, and was named a professor in 2020. She's previously been the History Program Director and Director of the Stout Research Centre for New Zealand Studies, during which time she's refreshed the centre's mandate as a pan-university centre and a public point of connection. Kate has also been a committed University Council member during times of significant decision-making for the university. In addition to her university-wide roles, she's an exemplary teacher who lives by the philosophy of creating emotionally engaged classrooms. She's known for inspiring her students to pursue further studies and postgraduate degrees, and is a strong advocate for the benefits of mentoring, especially in her own work through mentoring of other female academic colleagues. Now, in all of Kate's accomplishments that we celebrate tonight, it is her work as a scholar that is the lens through which we honour her contributions. Universities are called on to create and share new knowledge, new perspectives, and ways of understanding the world, and Kate's scholarship, her research, her teaching, her engagement does just that. People often think of history mainly through its ability to report on and to record the past. But by definition, history is also at its heart about inquiry, about the particular questions we ask and how we frame them and our methods of critical examination, and about what in the past has and has not been reported and recorded. There's always been questions about whose histories and whose voices we privilege in trying to understand how we have gotten to where we are now in our contemporary human experience. And Kate, throughout her career, is renowned for her ability to bring to light the essential significance of everyday lives, including everything from work on First World War family histories and cultural and personal artifacts, colonial fashion, film, the press, to wartime letters. History to me is also about narrative and storytelling, illuminating and preserving past culture. That's also what Kate does superbly well. She is a fabulous narrator. And this evening, she will reflect on her craft as a historian. Nā ko te honore ki te whakāto iene ahorangi, Kate Hunter. It is my great pleasure to now introduce Professor Kate Hunter.
I want to begin by acknowledging the House. This was the Memorial Library of Victoria College. Libraries some of my favourite places. They are treasure houses full of the most miraculous and strange things. I acknowledge this room as the place where the academic operations are discussed and planned during faculty boards. It is a rare and precious form of decision-making in which all voices are heard. It is one we need to defend. I acknowledge this as the council chamber, where over the last 6 years I have been a staff voice in the decisions made to govern the institution. There have been difficult decisions here, white-knuckle decisions, but there have been thrilling moments here too, and always a sense of shared responsibility, an enormous breadth of vision of what this place can be. I want to acknowledge the people who have stood here before me, especially the women. Women make up barely a quarter of VUW's professorial body, and we are overwhelmingly Pākehā. I acknowledge the ahorangi wahine in the room, and I acknowledge those who have passed on. I want to acknowledge the women who should have been here, ahorangi in mana, if not in rank. I also want to acknowledge my mother. First in her family to attend university, and first in the family she made. Having left school at 15, she began her BA at 40, and my teenage soundtrack was punctuated by the Olivetti on her desk in the kitchen. Tēnā koe rangatira. Thank you, John, Neil. Tēnā koe, Vice-Chancellor. Jennifer, my current Vice-Chancellor, and I think somewhere in the room, Les, my first Vice-Chancellor. Tēnā koutou, colleagues. Tēnā koutou whānau. Thank you all for being here. Okay, it's the emotional bit over, right? Historians are con artists. It's a bit harsh. Perhaps we are magicians. We're illusionists. We create narratives of the past that connect A to B, that link cause and consequence as railway lines with stations. Some historical actors get on and off. Archduke Ferdinand hopped on in June 1914 and was carried off rather unceremoniously quickly afterwards. Adolf Hitler got on the train in 1914, but no one really noticed him there in third class until station 1932, when he'd managed to bluff his way up to first class alongside Winston Churchill. We make the past feel inevitable, that it was only literally a matter of time before events occurred. Often without meaning to, we create the illusion that if only we study the past enough, we will see where the Hitlers and Stalins of the past got on the train. We can instruct our own station masters to be vigilant. Or to put it another way, as journalists and commentators often do, those who do not know their past are doomed to repeat it. But the past isn't railway lines. It's a pot of boiling water with spaghetti. It's last year's Christmas lights packed away in a hurry. It's the bag of yarn from the jersey you unravelled but haven't yet got round to winding. Historians are not unaware of this sleight of hand part of our profession, but we're also aware of how important our job is to make the tangle intelligible. We're the weavers. We take many threads of different colours, we weave them together, creating the illusion of a total, a block of solid colour, a whole picture. But depending on the weaver and the placement of the threads, the picture can look very different. And this is why debate is such a central part of our discipline. We argue not so much about what happened, although sometimes that can be a subject for rigorous discussion, but about the why, and very importantly, what it all meant. And this is where another slightly shady aspect of our characters comes into view. As I tell my students, although I'm sure they never believe me, historians are political animals. We're products of our own times, and our own research establishes and constructs our social relationships with the political structures of our own lives. It's no accident that narratives previously held as historical truths have been challenged at times of political upheaval and change in the present. In all of these permutations and challenges, evidence, the threads in the tapestry, are crucial. And the struggles to have different kinds of vestiges of the past accepted as legitimate evidence of a knowable history have been fought out. And I do mean fought. These were not always polite disagreements, because they were struggles for historical visibility, for meaning, for justice, but also for the status quo. And even where there were not open debates, the journey of particular sources to the archives was never inevitable and never smooth. In the 1930s, Australian official war historian Charles Bean urged the collection of soldiers' diaries and letters by the new War Memorial because they would add warmth to the otherwise frigid narratives of the unit diaries. However, many of the archivists receiving the letters from next of kin were put in a delicate position, because such letters, while clearly valuable to families, were of no historical interest. The vast majority of those letters spoke little about the fighting, and so tended to be returned without even being copied. Such decisions about legitimate evidence for history have, as you can imagine, had powerful consequences, as illustrated in 1969 by British historian Geoffrey Elton, who argued, and I quote him, that historical study is not the study of the past, but the study of present traces of the past. If men have said, thought, done, or suffered anything of which nothing any longer exists, those things are as if they have never been. Others might have argued a softer line, but most historians agreed that a lack of written evidence presented an insurmountable barrier to creating divergent historical narratives. The War Memorials collectors demonstrated that individual decisions about what constituted meaningful evidence shaped what filled archives. What became the present traces was already determined by current thinking. A man's experience of bombardment was significant, but not his loneliness for his homeland or his parents. Despite such arguments, the cultural fragmentation of the 1960s changed radically ideas about historical evidence. Women's history, oral history, Black and Indigenous histories, histories of everyday life, all brought new sources to bear on the past. Recollections and memories, spoken and sung accounts rather than written ones became central to many endeavours. The human consequences of the Great Depression, for example, were illuminated. Songs handed down in families and churches framed histories of life endured under slavery. Private papers, letters and photographs enriched existing histories and revealed new ones. But all the while, debates raged about objectivity, representativeness, and especially in the 1980s, the extent to which accepting multiple perspectives demanded acceptance of multiple truths. This backstory and ferment within the discipline of history only became clear to me when I was an undergraduate. It's part of what universities are for, and the thing that makes us subject of ridicule. Not just to generate knowledge, but to ask, how do we know what we know? And once you start questioning how we know and what we choose, one is in disorienting terrain, a place where your very self can be challenged. Yourself as a scholar, yourself as a white fella in a black fella country, yourself as a provincial young woman in an elite institution built on 600 years of male privilege. This is the labyrinth, and the Minotaur lurks within. If one job of the historian is weaving, making the past coherent and intelligible for readers, the other is making the labyrinth of intellectual discovery navigable for our students, and through our journals and our conferences, still sometimes for each other. Illusionists we may be, weavers definitely, but we are also Ariadne. We are the woman with the thread. Theseus may have slain the monster, but he would never got out of that maze, and no one would have ever known if it hadn't been for the woman with the yarn. So with Ariadne's thread firmly attached, let me take you away into the tangle that's been occupying me for the last few years. Let me ask you to imagine a large canvas tent on the periphery of a country showground in the 1930s. In the main arena, men in beige dust coats and narrow-brimmed hats judge cattle and sheep with an expert's eye. In the pavilion, there are tables of single blooms in vases, plates of vegetables, date loaves and fruitcakes, jars of pickles. The crowd is thick with best hats, gloves and handbags. But in those separate tents, where only men go, there is a bar, and in another, a boxing ring, and in another, a stage. A beer, a bet and a leg show, all to be had in their gloomy interiors. Then come away with me north into the red centre, into the vast and warm openness of Oriental country, to Alice Springs Telegraph Station, where Frank Gillan was appointed Post and Telegraph Master in 1892. The Springs Station, a collection of whitewashed daub buildings next to a waterhole that was, alas, the product of a few unusually wet years, was a link in the overland telegraph, a miraculous chain of imperial communication from Britain to Java, underwater to Darwin, overland to Adelaide. Post and telegraph masters, despite their astonishing isolation and remoteness, were more connected with the wider world than those in bustling Sydney. And now a bookshelf, on which is a small blue and white china dish containing a few ladies' watches, bands of gold and black leather, tiny numbers on delicate faces, slightly yellowed to ivory with age, dainty winding knobs, one of them engraved on the back with the name of its previous owner. They have all run down, and time is standing still. The period of Australian history that I've spent much of my career researching, the later 19th and early 20th centuries, was one of two worlds. One was modernising, socially and politically progressive. Politics, journalism, literature and art wrestled with the meanings of being part of an imperial family while forming a national government, producing sentimental expressions of belonging to an immense diverse continent. It was a society balancing and incorporating being part of a globalised network of travel, trade and communication while being at the very edges of empire. My PhD research into the lives of single rural women captured many of these themes as women fashioned their identities as both dutiful daughters and robust outdoor girls, aspiring to modern lifestyles even if their circumstances did not allow them to fully participate in such changes. There was another world that all Australian historians know, that of the desperate times endured by Indigenous people. By 1910, not only was land loss extensive and in most cases irrevocable, but all Australian states had in place legislation that not only defined Aboriginality in highly inconsistent and contradictory ways, but controlled almost every aspect of Indigenous life, where they lived, their movements, employment, marriage, and most notoriously, child rearing. By the end of the 1920s, legislation in almost all states declared all Aboriginal children under the age of 21 years to be wards of the state. These powerful structures of legislation, punishment and enforcement have dominated recent decades of stories of Aboriginal life, and for good reason. Such repression cannot be left untold. But Indigenous people have their own stories in amongst the pain, and stories are told and retold for their power. In Indigenous communities, it's called yarning. Iris Lovett Gardner and her sisters were showies, carnies in New Zealand. Travelling with sideshows, they worked as ticket sellers and on the fairy floss stand and on the line-up boards, attracting customers into the show tent. Iris also performed in the Spike Box act, in which the beautiful assistant was shut inside the spike box and the handle wound by an Indian in a caftan and turban until the spikes pressed through the front of the box and the blood dripped down the door. Shows like this had a range of acts. Iris described one of them as the Hoochie Coochie Girls. There was the Eastern Snake Girl, the Hula, the Dance of the Seven Veils. Other shows had Vanessa the Undresser, Teresa the Stripteaser. They had Fifi from Tahiti and Gigi from French Polynesia. Exotic and erotic. Except the performers weren't all that exotic. Iris and her sisters were Gunditj Mara, Aboriginal, as was the Indian in his caftan, and everyone in the audience would have known it. But like all audiences, they fell in with the performers in colluding in the fantasy. In the gloom of the tent with its sawdust floor and makeshift stage, the universally known but universally unacknowledged sexual history between white men and Aboriginal women was shimmied and shimmered away into something altogether more acceptable to dusky maidens and harem girls. When Aboriginal women performing as hula or harem girls appeared, however, they were not simply the objects of desire and fantasy. They had desires of their own. Girls were paid a steady wage in an age where most Aboriginal workers had a large proportions, up to 90% in some cases, of their meagre wages paid directly to the state's Aborigines boards, supposedly to be held in trust. These wages were either doled out piecemeal by the authorities or, more often, disappeared altogether. Sideshow performers, however, were out of the reach of the various authorities and were paid the same rates regardless of race. Iris also recalled it was an easy way to see new country and move around a bit. As Aboriginal people, we were always meeting up with other people that were Aboriginal too. Living expenses were taken care of in the show family, but there is some evidence that the women had to pay for materials to make their own costumes. Iris wrote that she and the girls with whom she worked made their own costumes. Bras and tights and spangles, the same colour as the skirt. Mine were always a pretty blue. She noted she had to buy the spangles herself, presumably out of her wages. This was a world away from her cousins. So many of Iris's contemporaries had been removed from their parents, were apprenticed or in domestic service with their wages held in trust. They wore their employers' cast-off clothing, saving their small allowances to buy essential and rudimentary clothing. That Iris and her sisters were buying spangles out of their wages can be seen as a strong statement of autonomy, self-determination, all that was modern, mobility, glamour, desire, proper wages. Little glass beads sparkling in the cracks of the nationwide system of surveillance and control. And those harem girls and their spangles stayed with me, Aboriginal and otherwise. While I worked on Iris's story, postgraduates, take note, it was a good 10 years before it saw print, I was spending a lot of time with First World War soldiers and their letters, their diaries, their photographs, and their souvenirs. And there's a lot more of them than there are farming women or Aboriginal showgirls. Egypt, the desert, Eastern women have a significant presence in those papers. Sequins, velvet and lace are more common than you'd think in war history. In recent fossicking, looking for ways the desert was perceived in interwar culture, I ended up shelf browsing. The thing where you go in for one thing, but you come out with 6 others that really aren't related to what you were looking for. A book on 7 Central Australian photographers who had made popular images of the interior of Australia and its peoples. For Eastern and coastal Australians, these images were often the first they'd seen of Australian deserts, although by the end of World War I, hundreds of thousands had seen the Egyptian desert and beyond. Early 20th century deserts were imbued with meaning from a wide variety of sources. They were biblical wastelands and places of exile and temptation. Californian deserts had been irrigated into verdant, fertile vineyards and croplands, and Australian politicians were arguing the same could happen. Orientalists turned up artefacts and maps and ruins that proved the Bible, shifting it from a moral guidebook to an historical document. Archaeology had revived interest in pharaonic Egypt, the classical world generally, and the birth of Western civilization. Discoveries of gold-filled tombs bolstered images of Aladdin's cave and the 1001 Nights. Deserts were places of nomads, herders, of Bedouins, tents, carpets, and camels. One of the earliest Australian desert photographers was Francis Frank Gillan, turn-of-the-century postmaster, amateur ethnographer, protector of Aborigines under the government system, and scholarly partner to Spencer Baldwin, Professor of Biology at the University of Melbourne. They published 2 books together on Central Australian Aboriginal clans and tribes and a swathe of scientific papers. Gillan was the son of Irish farmers, Baldwin of Manchester Congregationalists. Gillan was a night student at the South Australian School of Mines and Industries. Baldwin was educated at Oxford. There is a great deal of research on their scholarly partnership and on their friendship, so much more than on Iris Lovett-Gardner and her sisters and cousins. But Gillan's work was not what stopped me in my page browsing. It was, in fact, his slippers. Pipe in mouth, waistcoat buttoned, hands in pockets. Frank is wearing a pair of soft leather pumps elaborately embroidered with chrysanthemums and at startling odds with the stiff leather boots he wears in every other photograph. This unexpected image of fashionable domestic attire was a glimpse into the world of men's engagement with what was known in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as Eastern glamour. Usually associated with women's fashions, Orientalist design and sartorial style were also clearly enjoyed and purchased by men. By the 1890s, men's clothing had been revolutionised by the technologies of the sewing machine, imperial shipping networks and warehousing that supported the ready-made clothing industry. Boot and shoemaking too had become increasingly segregated, with women forming the bulk of the machining workforce and men dominating both cutting and finishing. The slippers were probably made from soft leather uppers, machine embroidered, attached to raw buck leather soles for indoor use and lined with satinette. Where Frank's slippers had come from is another question. His proximity to Darwin might signal that they came from the significant number of shops in that town catering to its large Japanese, Indonesian or Chinese population. Or they might have come from Melbourne, Sydney or Brisbane, all of which sustained large shoe and boot-making industries by this time. The glimpse of Frank's slippers lends weight to the claims of fashion pages and social columns of the late 19th century Australasian newspapers that declared Oriental embroidery was everywhere. And let's face it, Alice Springs Telegraph Station is about as far from anywhere and everywhere as you can get. The use of the term Oriental within Australasian newspapers was eclectic, however. Reports of the ball at Mrs. Tooth's residence in Darling Point, Sydney, illustrated that the term really had little fixed meaning. Mrs. Tooth received her guests in the Cairo room, the lofty pillared hall with its thick Persian carpets, statuary and oaken furniture was a feature of the house. Guests wore laces of Oriental embroidery, Oriental pendant of diamonds, rubies and grey pearls, and more Oriental embroidery, which was carefully distinguished from Indian silver embroidery. The term Oriental shifted and changed, sometimes blurring decorative influences and sometimes referring to quite specific things. It signalled that little about Oriental influences was connected to any kind of ethnographic impulse. And as the harem girls of the leg show tent remind us, Oriental could also be a device of disguise. While Eastern or Oriental were vague and untethered to specific places, the term didn't actually mean just anything. These terms signalled something to readers and consumers about colour, femininity, decorative features, and associations with opulence and leisure. A globalised fantasy of colour and adornment was at work, reflecting not only what the East represented in readers' and writers' minds, but also what Australasian, British and American designs and fashion were not. The author of the Four Ladies column knew her readers when she wrote in 1912 of new colours available for afternoon wear, if you were young and willing to take a chance. Some first-class dressmakers were willing to use a bright brownish sulphur colour for street costumes, but she knew that colour novelties are not apt to be favourites for street costumes, for they are too conspicuous, and most of us prefer to keep to the greyish greens, clay blues and homespun greys and tans for walking suits. Now, such minutiae of women's concerns about fashion and colour and silhouettes has been very easy to dismiss by historians. Despite there being volumes of present traces of the past, somehow I can't see Geoffrey Elton admitting that women's walking suit fashions or Frank Gillan's slippers were of particular historical import. I suggest, however, that in the interwar period, this minute description in fashion columns revealed much more than the latest outfits and fancies. In a long column in 1925, Women's Pages journalist for the rural newspaper The Weekly Times, Jacqueline Gore, described the rehabilitation of fashion after the end of the First World War and the role that colour played in the return to flamboyance in design. The war, she argued, removed colour from people's lives, and it was only just returning these many years after the armistice. Attempts had been made immediately following the war to rekindle an exuberant spirit in fashion, but it had failed. And Gore wrote, That success did not immediately attend was due to many reasons. The experiences from which even we, in remote, untouched Australia, were not wholly exempt, had taught us many things. That shadow, which for so many blotted out the sun itself, reflected upon those whose joy in living still remained. The atmosphere created by the hour and the hour's dread uncertainty exerted upon each and all an influence which remained long after a merciful alleviation of all anxiety, national and individual. It took time, however, for us to recover. Not immediately could we feel beneath us the sure foothold of other years. We had learned a lesson. The impossible had happened. The most frivolous, the most careless could not, with the signing of the armistice, at once forget. So why did Iris Lovett Gardner's sewing, Frank Gillan's slippers and Jacqueline Gore's meditation on war and colour catch my eye, when most historians would not, and indeed have not, noticed? Part of the answer is the blue and white china dish of ladies' watches. My grandmother was one of 7 daughters in a farming family with no sons. 4 married and 3 went nursing. They became career nurses and retired to a set of 4 units with my grandparents living in the 4th. They lived around the corner from me and were a constant presence in my life for the rest of theirs. One of my undergraduate essays was an oral history of my grandmother's Second World War. 2 of my great aunts allowed me to interview them about their lives for an honours essay that became about the impact of singlehood on women's historical visibility, or invisibility, as is the case. In all cases, they prefaced their agreement to be interviewed by insisting that their lives were not at all interesting. Researching their lives alerted me to the secret worlds of the unnoticed. From the impacts of the deeply entrenched motivations of duty, so often written about by historians in relation to young men in uniform, but never to young women with parents to care for. And the opportunities of wartime and its unexpectedly random effects, to the secret world of the nurse's home and the pros and cons of a bed under the window. You had fresh air and a view, but you got climbed on by the nurses who were home late and needed to be and had been locked out. Doing this kind of research began to train me to look for who wasn't there, who wasn't in the books we read, who wasn't in the newspaper or the archive. And it left me with a deep appreciation of how important it is to give students opportunities to work on their own topics, their own families, whānau and communities. And every day I see among my colleagues those opportunities offered and students supported to produce research that gives them a stronger sense of who they are. And time with my grandmother and my great aunts was never without handwork. Knitting, crocheting, sewing, leatherwork, making boxes out of old Christmas cards by sewing them together with ribbons. Always something quietly being worked on. Now, as 1 or 2 of you may know, I have a lifelong love of handwork. Knitting has been my constant occupation and quite possibly your constant distraction. I have a tremendous respect for the enormous skill and sheer mathematical talent required to knit a sock or a lace shawl. I have researched and written about the massive economic value of thousands of volunteer craftswomen and their underpinning of the welfare state, through everything from war production a century ago to contemporary knitters producing beanies for the homeless and booties and bonnets for every baby who leaves hospital. Literally the fabric of society. I have watched with interest as hipsters and influencers introduce handwork to a new generation. But I am also acutely aware of how knitting is portrayed as all charm and nostalgia, sustainability and slow fashion, until it's not. Until it reveals the underbelly of the status quo and the difficulty of shifting and remediating persistent inequalities. This lecture's not a finished garment. It's more like a group of tension squares. Just to give you a sense of this historian's craft, how and why I do what I do. Some of those tension squares are loose. They're full of holes. They're barely a fabric at all, like the barest fragments of Iris Lovett Gardner's story. But the gaps are as important as the stitches. They represent the places where she stepped out of history, away from the record-keeping machine of the state, in order to live her own life on her own terms. Frank Gillan's tension square, in all its tweedy solidity, might nonetheless reveal a silky lining. I'm still on the trail of that one. Stitching, sewing, weaving, wearing, they all tell us something about the hidden parts of history. Community, knowledge transmission, creativity, skill, welfare, autonomy, self-fashioning, resistance, the importance of the senses, touch, feel, colour. They make material and intimate the big engines of historical narratives such as industrialisation and capitalism and colonialism. They can lead us to question and defy these big engines too, as scholars such as Kaitahu historian Michael Stevens did in investigating the role his Pākehā Big Nana played in maintaining the titi harvesting traditions in his whānau through her weaving and pōha construction. As he concludes, it does not matter whether the hands that operate pōnamu chisels or construct pōha are Māori, Pākehā, or something born of the two. The key point is that the hands are skilled. But the evidence isn't easy to find. It takes time to accumulate. There are lots of dead ends and backtracking. How archives are shaped and organised, catalogued, all mitigates against certain types of histories, assuming the evidence can be found in those places in the first place. It's equally important sometimes to just pull out your knitting and see who comes to talk. The key point is that the hands are skilled. And far from being only frivolous and fun, colour and craft might give us clues to some contemporary challenges. We are living through a great catastrophe of our own time. Illness, dread, enforced separation of loved ones, deaths, the strangling of economies. Jacqueline Gore was writing several years after the armistice, after the First World War, and we might do well to take a lesson from the pages, not of Hansard or the War Office document, but from the women's pages, where emotional recovery was intertwined with economic and social recovery and played out over a decade after the crisis had passed. I will leave you with the insight of that great observer of life, Billy Connolly, to never trust a man who, when left alone in a room with a tea cosy, doesn't try it on. And I would add, and never trust an historian who doesn't ask, who made it? Ngā mihi nui.
E nā mana, e nā reo, e nā karangaranga maha, tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi nui ki a koutou kua tai, mai nei I tēnei pō, ki te whakarongo, ki te kōrero wahapu, ahorangi Kate Hunter, ko Simon Mackenzie tāku ingoa, ko oho, te amo te wahanga aranui. Good evening, everybody, and talofa lava, since it's Samoan Language Week. I'm Simon Mackenzie. I'm a professor of criminology in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, where Kate works, and I'm the acting dean at the moment, so I get the great pleasure and the privilege of proposing on behalf of us all a vote of thanks to Kate for her inaugural lecture as Professor of History at Te Heranga Waka. I feel like I should probably also start, God, I hope I'm not alone here, first of many I hope tonight, by putting my hand up and saying I have tried a tea cosy on my head on more than one occasion. If you come from Scotland and basically it's freezing cold the whole time and anything that's warm is at a premium, if you see a hot pot of tea with a hat on top of it, that's two for the price of one right there. That's something you want to get stuck into. Kate Hunter is an internationally renowned expert in history. As we've heard tonight, her particular field of expertise is the social and cultural history of Australia and New Zealand in the late 19th, early 20th century. Isn't it wonderful to hear a professor at the top of her game talking about the subject of her expertise? Won't you agree with me that sometimes history can be almost artistic when it's told eloquently in the way that we've heard tonight? Stories coming together to create pictures that give you a deep emotional connection to the subject matter in a way that often we don't get from historical stories. I'm a real fan of Kate's work. I was very pleased that I landed in the Dean's chair just at exactly the point that I get to give this particular vote of thanks, because I've been using some of it, I was telling her early on, for some of my own work. And so there are two things in particular that I want to thank Kate for tonight. Two things that I find especially captivating about her work. The first one is the bringing to light of the hidden voices submerged in the historical record. The forgotten parts of everyday lives that have been overlooked, or sometimes the deliberately ignored people who may have been deemed insignificant by the various standpoints vested in discourses of power that have written our histories. These are the people she refers to in her 2011 paper as the inarticulate actors in the colonial past. So no longer inarticulate then when told through the eyes of a particularly articulate reporter like Kate. It's hard enough to bring excluded people into the frame when they're here and alive. How much harder must it be to try to find people in the archives, to find the traces of these inarticulate actors and to recreate them in a way that gives them contemporary recognition? So that's the first thing I want to thank Kate for bringing back in this way those who would otherwise be long lost. The second thing is her focus on objects. We've heard quite a few things about objects tonight: spangles and slippers and a lot of knitting. I knew there would be a lot of knitting. I think we all did. So academics, especially sort of sociologically leaning ones like me, have for a long time made the mistake of tending to assume that the world is mostly made up of people. And I mean, of course, that ignores the material world around us. And these are the objects that give some important context for our social lives. In recognition of this, you've got major figures like Bruno Latour talking about reassembling the social, in other words, taking the idea of the social and bringing objects in as well as people so that we can understand the effects that these things have on each other. There's a good and well-respected line now in object biographies, which is telling the social lives of objects as they move through time and through context. In fact, I've got some of Kate's words here, Kate's words that I'm going to use. The life histories of objects as they move through and between cultures and the way that their meaning changes with context. The social lives of objects, in other words. That's from one of our papers on bird feathers. And again, some of us are doing object biographies, but we have now, I realize, the luxury of following these things in real time because they're here and they're moving around the world. Again, how much more challenging it must be to do this kind of thingology, as a bit of a sort of ungainly word, that, isn't it? The ology of things. To do that in relation to things that are just a line in an archive or a side note in a book somewhere, which is mostly concerned with something else, usually people. So thank you, Kate, for your study of things. And putting these two together, we've got a very rich historical method, a tapestry of stories about people and things that are not normally noticed, a voice to the voiceless, a spotlight for forgotten actors, and a celebration of things that have been left behind. I mentioned this lecture to a friend, told him that I was coming here, told him more or less what it was about. I think I probably didn't do it very well because they sort of stood for a minute and said, "Oh, right, so it's history but not the important bits." No. Yeah. No, it's not. It's not that at all. But you know, in the process of saying that, what are the important bits? That's we're socially conditioned to think certain things are important, aren't we? And the various sort of structures of power that sit around that determine what we look for. And Kate's work is a magnificent and a modest and a meticulous challenge to that, bringing us not only to see the past in a different way, but also in doing that potentially to reframe our understanding of the present, of what we think is important and why. So I'm really glad that we've all had the chance to hear more about it this evening. Kate, on behalf of your faculty, FHSS, yay, we are so proud to have you as a member of our professoriate, proud and grateful. On behalf of all of your friends and your colleagues and your family here tonight, thank you for giving us an insight into how you do this particular type of scholarly knitting. If you ever want to use the provocative title, History But Not the Important Bits, I can tell you who was the one who came up with that. A wonderful lecture. Now, I'm pleased to say that I don't think we've got any tea or tea cozies, but we do have quite a lot of wine and beer and soft drinks outside. So I'd like to invite everybody to come and party with us. And before that, Ngā mihi nui kia koe, Kate. Let's give a big round of applause to Professor Gillan.